Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. There's an old Danish proverb that has been over the years attributed to many that says that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Nowhere is this more true than in the realm of politics. Back in 2004, 15 years ago, distinguished journalists and political scientists John Judas and Rudy Teixeira wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority. Since then, we've had 8 years of George W. Bush, the Tea Party, the election of Donald Trump, and 8 million Americans who voted twice for Barack Obama and then voted for Trump. Now, distinguished pollster and political advisor Stanley Greenberg adds to his previous body of work in arguing that demography is destiny and that the death of the currently constituted Republican Party is inevitable. Stanley Greenberg is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, It's the Middle Class Stupid. He's been a polling advisor to presidents, prime ministers, and CEOs around the world. It is my pleasure to welcome Stanley Greenberg to the Who, What, Why podcast to talk about his new book looking at the end of the Republican Party, as well as some of the demographic and polling trends leading up to the 2020 election. Stan, thanks so much for joining me once again.
Indeed. Thanks for having me back, and I'm delighted to talk about my dangerous and brave predictions about what will happen in 2020. I will push back just on demographics being destiny, because it pained me. And in fact, if I want to understand what motivated me to wake up every day to write, what am I doing today to contribute to ending this awful period, part of it was, I think, was guilt over the fact that the Hillary Clinton campaign believed that theory, even though I didn't believe the theory. They did, and acted as if the demographics was destiny, and also that his offending group after group would produce a Democratic engagement. And it was obviously very tragic that happened. But what is different, though, is the mobilization, the engagement, the public consciousness that has been mobilized, escalated by Trump's victory. And that really changes the dynamic tremendously. I mean, the demographic trends are accelerating. The percent foreign-born in America just keeps going up and up to historic, levels. The country is more diverse, more metropolitan, more millennial and young. More immigrant, more unmarried, more secular. All the trends that push back against conservative and Republican governance. But that's not what makes a difference. What makes a difference is that the day after the Women's March, people organized and they turned out in the off-year elections in the biggest turnout probably in the history of the country. Certainly the biggest increase in turnout in the midterm election. Huge, turnout, and it's increased since. In every election I've ever polled in, after it happens, after you get the results in, interest in politics drops, then goes up month by month as you enter the next election. Interest today is 10 points higher than it was in November 18, as people just have not disengaged. They've engaged further and further. And also there's been a shift of public consciousness, above all in immigration. The country's become more multicultural, more pro-immigration. Every day that Trump pushes his agenda, the country is embracing the opposite. So anyway, that's what makes me confident.
To what extent, though, is that happening to the degree that it could make a political difference in 32 red states out there that will still probably have Republican senators, and even though they will still represent a minority of the country, they'll represent a majority in the Senate, arguably, and the Electoral College, which very much goes hand in hand with that?
Well, I'm less worried about the Electoral College because I believe the country, realigned in 2018, and has moved, and it's continued to move, since then. The rural voters, working class voters. Let's focus on working class voters. Mm-hmm. White working class voters, women and men, shifted 13 points toward the Democrats from 16 to 18. So there was a white working class shift, and that's the reason why you get such a big swing to Democrats congressionally. From Maine, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Kansas. I mean, there was a, and that was a working class shift. And when you look at the data, the swing of white working class women has continued. So the men are pulling back, toward Trump, but not the white working class women. They're headed toward, just single digit win for Republicans. And a majority of the white working class are women. And so there was a realigning election that happened, and the trends have increased after the election. History doesn't stop. And so I'm really not that worried about the battleground states. Now, I never want to have a presidential campaign, that takes those voters for granted, either as a tactic or in terms of respect. And I think the Democratic candidates are running very forcefully to win those voters. And so, yes, you're right to worry about it. Now you're more. I think you're on the mark when it comes to the Senate, because obviously we have a system that is rigged in favor of rural areas, and that's not going to change. And so that even if we have a wave election, we're going to be just on the edge, winning control in the Senate. I think it can break for us. And will break for us in a big wave election, but that's what it will require. But it does mean that you have these once in a lifetime, once in a generation chance to move forward and bring the kind of reforms the country is desperate to have.
To what extent? I mean, it certainly makes sense when you lay out the numbers in a theoretical case, but in a situation where it's Trump running against a specific person. To what degree is that going to have a profound impact on how this plays out?
Part of what's happening is that we focus on what Trump is doing and how much he's building his base, but we miss how much of what he's doing is driving the anti-Trump voter to the polls and to cast a vote almost regardless of candidate. I mean, right now, if you look at at our polls. We have Bernie Sanders ahead by 5, Trump ahead by 7, Biden ahead by 9. The other polls have bigger margin, but all of those margins are greater, or right there or above what Barack Obama had in 2008 when we had a near landslide election with the financial crisis, and when he took office with Democrats in control of all offices. So almost all our candidates are polling Obama level or better, and the reason is that you have the anti-Trump feeling. Let's start with who's voting in the Democratic primaries and Republican. Right now, it's 47% are voting in Democratic primaries, 37% are voting in Republican. So in terms of who's following politics, there's like a 10-point gap in favor of Democrats and people engaging with who the Democratic leader should be. The Democrats won the off-year elections with an 8.6% margin, a 9-point margin. So you're looking at it like a 9-point margin from 18. Right now, the level of engagement with politics has a 10-point edge, for Democrats. When you ask Republicans, whether they strongly approve of Trump, it's 65%. But if you ask Democrats, their strong disapprove is 20 points stronger. It's 85%. Democrats are so anti-Trump and consolidated and engaged that they are giving Democratic candidates, regardless of the candidate, Trump's at 41%. Only 3% of Democrats are voting for Trump. And so it's the anti-Trump reaction that is driving things. And we just, when we show focus groups, and we've now done this, when we show Trump, his own tweets, we show him at his rallies, we show him at his press conferences. First of all, if we show it to our unregistered voters, it motivates them. The best thing we can do for our own voters is simply show Trump. And so Trump is in their face every day. And the consequence of that is our people are more engaged. But we also did it with white working class women in non-metropolitan, mostly rural areas, in Maine, Wisconsin and Nevada. And when the women watch him on TV, they shake their head. They think he's being a bully. They think he's divisive. It means he can't get anything done. Most of them are still voting for him, but they're pulling back, and there is evidence that they're pulling back. But his being in their face every day is making them less likely to vote, less supportive, and so they've kind of lost control of their ability to affect events.
To what extent, though, has the number of anti-Trump voters increased in those places that matter? Certainly there's more anti-Trump voters in states that Hillary Clinton carried. But are there enough additional anti-Trump voters in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio?
As you know, in 2016, a lot of our voters, disengaged. They were not motivated by Hillary Clinton's campaign, nor did they. She reached out to them in a way that, proved motivating. I mean, to be honest, she was, her message was build on the progress, third term of Obama, at the same time that Trump was promising to disrupt things and identifying, with their lost American jobs and their struggling, how much they were struggling financially. So Democrats did not motivate, our voters. And I'm going to be honest, we didn't motivate our voters for 8 decades. I mean, my book is pretty critical, of President Obama's presidency and, the failure to understand how much TARP, the bailout of the banks, was seen as, a corrupt bailout of the irresponsible, while working people, lost their homes. Nothing was done about foreclosure. He tried to sell the country on build on the progress. We're moving in the right economic direction. We know he lost white working class voters, very quickly, but he actually lost or saw the disengagement of working class voters across race. So we had a huge drop in turnout in 2010 and even more in 2014. And so the reason the Republicans had control of so many states was that Democrats seemed to be simply buying out the banks, rather than building an economy that worked for the middle class, and just did not enact the kinds of policies that would benefit the broad middle class. And they paid a very big price for it.
Talk a little bit about the demographic shift, and that is something that has been going on for a while. Have we seen an impact from that in our electoral politics nationally? And is that something we're going to continue to see, particularly as we go into 2020?
Well, look, there's two pieces to it. One is the fact that Democrats are battling for white working class voters in ways, that we haven't done in a while. During the Obama presidency, during the Hillary Clinton, closed down the campaign in those areas, didn't do advertising, and paid a very, high price for it. The Democratic Party as a whole is so focused on winning those voters. Watch all the presidential candidates that are doing that. But also we're also dealing with a country that accepts its multiculturalism, accepts that it's diverse, believes we ought to be engaged, in the world, believes in equality and opportunity, believes we have an unfinished agenda to deal with racial and gender, inequalities. Above all, believe we need to address the corrupt politics, but it's built in a growing base that is younger, more diverse, more foreign-born and immigrant, and more metropolitan than secular, and that has not stopped. That's accelerated, and so it's made an available base to Democrats. That's clearly a majority of the country, and what Trump has done is made Democrats run as self-confident about our values, about the fact that we're a diverse and multicultural country. We were an immigrant country, and we will welcome immigrants in the future. It enriches us, as a country. And if you look at the 2018 election, yes, we lost the governor's race in Georgia. We lost the governor's race, in Florida. Both were stolen from us. The state should have been won. But Democrats, ran an election where the president was running as the Republicans as an anti-immigrant party against us, fighting that, diversity, fighting, and the Republicans in those states doing everything possible visibly to keep blacks from voting. And yet Democrats had a landslide election came within a few thousand votes of winning Georgia and Florida with African-American candidates. I just think we should recognize what's happening. It's not just the demographic changes. It's recognize those changes define our values and our worldview. And now we're contesting a Republican Party that believes immigration, the demographic problem, is the central problem facing the country. And it will face a shattering defeat in 20, and that will have huge implications for what kind of country we are.
Will Rogers once said that he wasn't a member of any organized political party. He was a Democrat. To what extent can the Democrats mess this up? To what extent can they make mistakes that will in fact play against all of the things you're talking about, Stan?
Well, we could do it. I was pretty critical of the Hillary Clinton campaign because, above all, for not being, not dealing with the economic pain people were facing, not dealing with the rigged political and economic system where business and politicians have corrupted the system and made it very hard for government to work for the average person. I believe that needs to drive our messages, and I believe most of the candidates are doing that. But I don't believe identity politics is motivating for our base of voters. I tried to convince the Hillary Clinton campaign, when she was running on ladders of opportunity, which was her theme, and also Barack Obama's theme. And that notion was that inequality was based on the blockages that each group in America, face. And what we needed to do was create opportunity and block those barriers at the top. But in fact, that wasn't motivating for African Americans in the 2016 election. And I know it isn't now. They are most motivated by wanting to get a politician elected who will change the economy, change our politics, and make it work for the average person. They believe they will benefit by electing someone who's going to think big in terms of large-scale investment, creating jobs, addressing inequality, addressing poverty, and in the process, finishing the unfinished job of discrimination that African Americans, Hispanics, and women face. And I think the Democrats are moving toward that kind of messaging, but I watched it with Hillary Clinton. She was very cautious about a strong economic message. But I'm not sure I see that with any of the candidates. I think all the candidates I look at have a strong economic message. Even Vice President Biden, who is running more on continuity, is still talking about what's happened to the middle class, and that's also part of his message.
Isn't there a bit of a booby trap built into the argument for radical change right now among some progressive Democrats, in that after 4 years of Trump, there's a certain exhaustion, a certain fatigue, and arguably a certain desire for some kind of stability without radical change at the moment, even if it's a sense of continuity, as Biden is arguing?
I don't see any evidence for that. We need to understand the period we've come out of, and it's why I'm confident that the Republicans are going to crash. We've had a decade of Tea Party GOP governance, which has tried to stop government in its tracks. From the moment they took office after the Tea Party wave in 2010, they produced budget austerity in the states. They cut taxes for the rich, cut public spending, cut education, fired teachers. They reduced the federal budget, this rate of spending in the federal budget, focused on the deficit. There was nothing that the government can do for a decade to address inequality, wage stagnation, healthcare costs, prescription drugs, climate change, gun violence. For over a decade, we've had this building, desperate desire for the country, Democrats in particular, but it's also in the country as a whole. There's been a surge in the percentage of people saying that government ought to have a bigger role rather than business and individuals. And if you look at almost any question about a government policy, about 75 to 85% of Democrats want it to happen. So after this decade of government being suffocated there is this pent-up demand to attack these issues, and that's what I believe the public is looking for, and I think that's what you'll see. And I think that's what you've seen, from the various candidates who have been running. Not just in Warren's plans, versus Biden. Look across the Democratic field in terms of what they're proposing on health care, what they're proposing on climate change, what they're proposing on guns. There's a huge hunger for government activism, and I think they're responding to it.
When you talk about the potential demise of the Republican Party, are you talking about it in terms of the national Republican Party, or how do you see that playing out on a state and local level?
The Republican Party had a deep base, first in the Deep South, then in the South as a whole. They expanded it into the Appalachian Valley, and more rural parts of the country where evangelicals and religiously observant, were dominant. And so it was a party, of faith that supported it and allowed it to win huge numbers of Senate seats and hold a high proportion of the states, particularly because these are, smaller states. But that's been eroded. I mean, the fact that Georgia, Florida, Texas are going to be contested, states, this year, and I think forever, as these trends, accelerate. I think the numbers of, states that are red states are, and with total control will be dramatically, reduced, from where it was. The question is what happens after the election. I mean, once you lose power in this way, I think we're talking about a party, more like the Whigs couldn't address slavery. Here we have a Republican Party, Tea Party and evangelical dominated, running against abortion, sexual revolution, running against immigration as its overriding purpose in a country that is secular, unmarried, very pluralistic on family types, totally changing country where women, three-quarters of women work, and I think 2/3 are either sole breadwinner, or shared breadwinner. So you have this dramatic change of the family. The Republican Party that to this day is fighting contraception. That was its suit against the Affordable Care Act. They're fighting abortion in every state where they have control, and on the Supreme Court, and back to constitutional amendment on abortion. I mean, they are in the last throes of a battle against social modernity, in which they are and immigration, in which they are going to lose as this country is more immigrant, foreign-born, more diverse. And so, what's their relevance? What is their purpose after they lose this election? And every trend I'm talking about is accelerating. Mm-hmm. We're accelerating demographic trends, accelerating mobilization, accelerating consciousness, accelerated Tea Party evangelical control of their own party. They've driven out, 10% of the Republicans who were McCain and moderates have pushed out in the last year. So they are very marginalized and have a purpose that just doesn't fit the times.
Does some kind of party realignment bode for the future in which some new Republican Party emerges that is more socially progressive, yes, but in keeping some of its traditional constitutional conservatism?
Yeah, I mean, there has to be something. We're not, we're a two-party system. There's going to be other parties. They will have, control in some states, as you pointed out. But it took 4 elections. If you look at what happened with the Democrats from Ronald Reagan in '80 to the Mondale, nationwide, landslide election. I mean, it took 4 elections for Democrats who fought it out internally to finally change in a way that made them sustainable, nationally. And it may take, it'll take many elections for them to come back because the Tea Party evangelical bloc is not going to go away, and Trump may not go away. He may fight for the future of the party as well. And so I don't know, I don't know what happens, afterwards. I mean, I just know that they're on a accelerated trajectory, steeper and steeper, on embracing issues that are just lost. and rejected by the country. They will be illegitimate after this election. It'll be tough to be a millennial, be a Republican, and be a millennial and be a Republican, given where they are on climate change, where they are on gay marriage, and immigration, and so DACA, and so we're going to have a period of conflict and renewal within the Republican Party, but there has to be. I just don't know where they go. In the book, I propose that the Democrats deal with comprehensive immigration reform to get it off the table, in the same way welfare reform changed the party's position.
Do you see a situation where people are more or less politically engaged if the Democrats are successful in 2020? And what is the level of political participation you see at that point?
Mm-hmm. I projected history toward the 2020, but I've become very uncertain about how the Republican Party then becomes renewed, after this election. And I'm uncertain what happens, in the period afterwards. But what I believe is that we are entering a period of progressive reform that I assume will lead to increased engagement. Look, you can't match the 2018 off-year election. Everything I'm looking at, for 2020 is we're going to see millions and millions of new voters and have a turnout level, that exceeds anything, we've seen in our history. So this election is going to be a one-time huge event. I think it's one that will leave the Republican Party shattered and trying to figure out what is their relevance, what is their new purpose in this. But I also think it's a period where the government is going to be liberated to address a whole range of problems, and it begins with the corruption that is and role of big money in government that the Democrats are determined to stop as a precondition for doing everything else. But it's also going to move to deal with universal health care. It'll move to deal, with climate change and gun violence. There will be, and also, inequalities and entrenched poverty. And there's so many policies that are able to address that. And so I think there's going to be a burst of public policy, in the next couple of years after the election, and mobilization, around the issues that presumably a Democratic president is trying to push through the Congress. And so it's a new kind of engagement if we believe that we're entering a new period of reform.
Stanley Greenberg, his book is R.I.P. GOP, How the New America is Dooming the Republicans. Stan, always a pleasure. I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you. Love doing it.
And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.